which I'm sure doesn't need any great introduction. The changes in Eastern Europe involving Gorbachevs Russia have been of profound importance to socialists the world over. And this afternoon we have Chris Harman, a socialist worker, and Monty Johnson to debate on Gorbachevs Russia. The procedure will be that Monty Johnson will speak first for 20 minutes, Chris will reply for 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. The speakers will then sum up at the end of that discussion in reverse order. In the discussion, there are speaker slips which people are walking around with. Anybody who wants to speak, could they please indicate on one of those speaker slips that we passed up here? And can they also please indicate which side of the debate they want to come in on in order that we can ensure a good balance to their contributions. In particular, I'd like to encourage any people who want to support Monty Johnson's side of the argument to indicate that so that we give them a fair hearing and a fair representation this afternoon. That's a very serious point, comrades. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Monty Johnson to speak for 20 minutes on Gorbachevs Russia.
Well, comrades, I feel that I've got one advantage over Chris, and I'm not thinking about the superiority of my argument, which I'm sure will become apparent to all of you within the next 20 minutes. But I was actually offered a sneak preview on Friday evening at Chris's lecture to hear his views, and I don't imagine that they will have changed very substantially in the last 24 or so hours. Chris started off then by arguing that, as he put it, almost no one, apart, of course, from himself and SWP, recognised the crisis that had been building up in the Soviet Union when they were discussing Soviet development 5 years ago. This is certainly not true as far as we're concerned. Near the end of the Chernenko period, Marxism Today published an article, which I happen to be the author, pointing to what I call the profound decline in the rates of growth in the European socialist countries, and pointing to the critical proportions assumed by unfulfilled expectations and the contrast between promise and performance, which I went on to say produce growing signs of apathy, malaise, and dissatisfaction. The article looked forward to Gorbachev succeeding Chernenko and starting to loosen the party leadership's paternalistic control over political, social, and cultural life, though I doubted whether Gorbachev could be expected to carry through the sort of socialist democratization undertaken by Dubček and the Czechoslovak Communist Party in the 1968 spring. That experience was to prove me wrong on the last point. But what about Chris and the SWP? In the 1983 edition of his book, Class Struggle in Eastern Europe, which I have studied most assiduously, Chris certainly adduced a great deal of evidence of the developing crisis. But what were his conclusions? Let me quote from page 305. If economic reform cannot magic new economic growth out of nothing, then it cannot allow the ruling class to relax its hold on the rest of the population. Political reform, too, is ruled out, unquote. And equally refers, in contrast to a subtitle in a recent article of his, Splits in the Leadership, he equally refers to the party leaders, managers, generals and the rest of them as forming a solid phalanx who are united together on all crucial issues. This in a book which was seeking to show that only the SWP's characterization of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as state capitalism can explain the forces at work in these countries. On the contrary, it seems to me that the theory of state capitalism totally fails to comprehend the dynamic of change in these countries and the forces within them bringing about the important reforms that we are seeing today in the Soviet Union. All of Chris's recent and generally well-researched writings, I've read them all, I think, have tried to minimize the extent and importance that these changes, the changes that have taken place. Though, of course, he can't actually deny them all. And he attempts to contrast what has been achieved with what might and hopefully in time will be achieved, rather than with what the position actually was up to 2 or 3 years ago, which is the only serious basis of comparison for Marxist materials. He fails to recognise what Ralph Miliband and other editors of Socialist Register 1988, together with large sections of the left generally, have appreciated, i.e., I quote, the immense significance of what is occurring in the Soviet Union. From a socialist point of view, it represents one of the most hopeful developments anywhere in the world since Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. If it is allowed to proceed, it will undoubtedly help the socialist cause on a global scale. On Friday evening, an SWP comrade referred to a speech which I had made at Haringey, in which he said I denied the significance of the working class for the Soviet political process. Admittedly, afterwards he told me he was only trying to provoke me. But in fact, both at that meeting and also in an article in May Marxism Today, which anybody can check out if they want, on the Soviet elections from which I just returned, I pointed out that with these elections, perestroika had entered a new stage with the independent appearance of the working people on the political arena. I spoke of the well-attended and lively election meetings that I'd attended in working class districts with no holds barred questions, critical contribution to discussion and so on, as well as the predominantly working class support for Yeltsin's voicing of their grievances against the bureaucratic methods. But I added, the fact that only 18.6% of those elected are workers shows that much more needs to be done to make the official description of the working class as the leading force in Soviet society a reality. However, let us recognise that important steps have been taken in that crucial direction of ensuring the independent participation of the working class in the running of Soviet society, which was, after all, the essential objective of the revolution. The perestroika, it is true, started from above, but Gorbachev was already stressing meetings up and down the Soviet Union from the summer and autumn of 1986 that it could only succeed if it became also a movement from below, with working people criticising and removing bureaucratic leaders, initiating changes, and also including self-management in industry. He criticised at the Trade Union Congress in February 1987 those trade union officials who, as he put it, were dancing cheek by cheek with economic managers. And he stressed trade union committees must also consistently defend workers' interests against managers and against the technocratic trends in Soviet society. These changes in the trade unions are developing, but admittedly unevenly. As in all other spheres of perestroika, they are confronted with serious bureaucratic resistances. But hope lies precisely in working to change the existing trade unions with their 140 million members, rather than in forming breakaway trade unions, though obviously the workers should have the right to form whatever organisations they want. Indeed, under Gorbachev there has been a revision in thinking on the whole conception of self-management, which was previously dismissed as being some kind of anarcho-syndicalist or Yugoslav revisionist deviation. Now, socialist self-management is at the centre of the debates and objectives, and is reflected in the law on state enterprises, which was debated in the spring and summer of 1987 when it was passed, and it provides for the election of country directors by the employees in every enterprise, as well as of works councils. Certainly, the process has not gone smoothly. The bureaucratic resistances, which I referred to, are there as well as elsewhere from existing managers and from the ministries, but there are also important examples of its implementation and the involvement of working people. And I believe that it is a genuine basis for advancing to fuller workers' involvement in the democratic self-management, which obviously no capitalist country can provide. There is a need for Marxists to put developments in their historical perspective and to assess trends. Although the mass terror ceased with Stalin's death, bureaucratic structures in politics and economics continued and led the country into the deep crisis which it's in at the present time. What is now being attempted is a deep-going reform of the political and the economic spheres in order to overcome the Stalinist legacy, in order to carry through a process of democratization and to advance towards full socialist self-management. This involves struggle between bureaucratic, authoritarian forces and anti-bureaucratic reforming forces at every level. Of course, the position of the reforming forces is heterogeneous, and obviously the whole position of perestroika is made more difficult by, firstly, the accumulated economic problems, especially in the provision of foodstuffs and consumer goods, and secondly, in the accumulated national tensions, which have taken sometimes tragic forms and which Gorbachev spoke about on Soviet television yesterday. These problems will take a considerable time to solve. There are no magic or quick solutions, but their solution will only take place within the framework of developing and extending the process of democratization in a responsible but a determined manner. I would totally reject Chris's writing off of the possibility of the reform of the Communist Party, where in fact the struggle is going on at its most intense. Already it has changed the Communist Party to an extent which he would never previously have thought possible, and in my opinion it can change considerably further, although undoubtedly it will do so in fits and starts as it has done up till now. Don't forget, comrades, that it was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, headed by Gorbachev at its 19th conference, that launched the slogan of all power to the Soviets, and took, relaunched the slogan, relaunched the slogan, all power to the Soviets, which has been regarded as purely historical slogan, and not only relaunched the slogan, but took the practical steps in order to produce the election contests which took place in 3/4 of the constituencies. And although in the remaining quarter old entrenched bureaucrats have succeeded in ensuring that they alone should have their names appearing on the ballot paper, in many of them there appeared independent organisations, campaigns, informal groups campaigning against them, with the result that people went to the poll and voted against them, as you can in Soviet elections, and many of them were in fact not elected, as that included quite high bureaucrats, like for instance Yuri Sargov, in the secretary of the Leningrad Obkom of the party and alternate member of the political bureau. From out of these elections, we've seen the exciting, hard-hitting and critical debates of the Congress of People's Deputies, which have been televised live throughout the Soviet Union, just following a time when Chris said that in one of his articles that television that had been allowing criticism was now drawing its horns in that respect. And in fact, what the vast bulk of the Soviet population in virtual production dropped quite seriously during the period of the Congress of People's Deputies. Everybody was watching the television, but that showed criticism and so on of a kind that went further than anything that has done before in the Soviet Union since the early years of the Lenin period. Nor did the conservative forces, on whose position at the Congress Chris in his articles has concentrated, get everything their way. You had, for instance, one of the deputies, Vlasov, attacking the KGB's underground empire, as he called it, and as a result of that, a commission being accepted to look into and control the KGB. Obviously, in the commission there will be more struggle, but the whole process of bringing the KGB and other organizations under popular scrutiny and popular control. The Supreme Soviet, which was elected from out of the Congress of People's Deputies and was written off as being clearly a sort of right-wing thing, showed in fact that it had teeth. It was refused to approve 6 of the ministers who were proposed by Rishkov, the Prime Minister. He had to put forward others. All the candidates for high office, including the director of the KGB, had to undergo questioning in the Congress of People's Deputies of an extremely searching kind. This is an extent of democratic control and so on, which obviously needs to be extended further, but does represent something quite unprecedented compared with what had existed throughout the Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras preceding it. So you had, in fact, these lively debates and this exercise of power, admittedly, with divisions and so on, and with strong conservative forces, but also backed up from outside with popular involvement. Every day throughout the meeting of the Congress of People's Deputies at Luzhniki, just near the big sports stadium in what was previously a car park, which I attended some of the meetings during the election period, were filled with people coming along and so on, listening to their deputies to discuss what was happening and putting their point of view to them and so on. Tens and even over 100,000 people coming along to these meetings. This is genuine political participation and so on, and it is now guaranteed that this will be a regular place where people can meet. Alongside of this, you had the continuation of the whole process of freer debate and discussion in the media, not only the official media, but of course the development of a whole number of unofficial papers, the development of the so-called informal groups, the revision of history, the revision of the Moscow trials, the opportunity for people now to be able to read about the leaders of the revolution, including Trotsky, in a much more objective way, and a process where more and more of these works are going to be available to the Soviet people. Too slowly, and there's bureaucratic resistance to it, but the process is going forward. Indeed, in the Baltic republics, where I was following the elections, there are, to all intents and purposes, embryonic multi-party systems already existing. In the elections, the candidates of the Interprésienne and the candidates of the Popular Front were contesting on clearly different programs, and people were voting according to the position. And I believe that this process will go further forward, and I believe that it will lead ultimately, although again it's a process, the whole thing is a process which will take time and so on, but I believe we will end up with the development of some kind of multi-party system similar to what you had in Lenin's day in the Soviet Union. Many Communist Party people have come out quite openly for it, quite apart from leaders of the informal organizations. It's true at the moment, Gorbachevs and the top leadership have said they're opposed to it. So, 2 or 3 months ago, the Grosz and the leaders of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. I believe that the situation will change and their opinions also will change. The SWP relates all the problems of the Soviet Union to the highly simplistic formula, what it calls the dynamic of competitive accumulation, in which the Soviet Union is supposed to have been engaged with the capitalist world in economic and particularly the military sphere since 1928, which is the magic year in the SWP mythology. Now, there's no time here to argue the full theory of state capitalism. I've done it on about 5 occasions with Tony Cliff in the past 25 years. Certainly, however, the Soviet Union accumulates and invests, as indeed any thoroughly healthy socialist society would do, and as Marx in the Critique of the Gorbachevs program. I'm not suggesting that the Soviet Union is yet a thoroughly healthy socialist society. I'm suggesting if it was a thoroughly healthy socialist society, it would still lead to accumulate and invest, as Marx explained very well in his critique of the Gotha program, which I'm sure most of you are well acquainted. In other words, accumulation and investment is not a characteristic limited to capitalism. Economic reform, writes Chris in his class struggles in Eastern Europe, cannot remove the cancer of waste and inefficiency because it cannot stop those who run the economies wanting to compete on an international scale and therefore having to tie down very large parts of the national income in particular investment projects, notably armaments. This must apparently inevitably bring every communist leadership into conflict with the interests and demands of the masses. Now, no explanation is offered as to why all the communist leaders should want, and that's Chris's phrase, want subjective choice, an arms race. Surely the most impressive part of Gorbachev's leadership, which incidentally is the reason for his enormous popularity among ordinary people throughout the world, has been in his consistent, intelligent, flexible and far-reaching disarmament proposals, as well as disarmament actions withdrawing from Afghanistan, unilateral steps of disarmament, a revision of the whole conception of parity in favour of sufficiency and so on. The fact is that the armaments race, far from being wanted by the Soviet leadership, is seen quite rightly as the greatest possible drag on the Soviet economy and the greatest possible obstacle to the realization of perestroika. And it's very sad that Chris should downplay the Soviet disarmament proposals and put the Soviet Union in that respect on the same plane as US imperialism, which is very, very differently motivated by a very, very different economic system. In addition, we have the deus ex machina of the international or anti-international revolution, seen as the only way out of the Soviet crisis. This conception of an international revolution in the foreseeable future is, so to speak, the SWP's ideological amphetamine. The problems of the Soviet Union are said to flow from the initial choice of building socialism in one country rather than choosing the international revolution. Of course the Soviet Union had no such choice. If it had had the choice of calling forth the international revolution, as Lenin, Trotsky, the Communist International and all the rest of them attempted to do after they took power in 1917, you would presumably have had a successful international revolution in that period if it were possible. But it became perfectly clear that after the immediate post-war upsurge, that was not possible. You can't just call forth an international revolution. The Soviet state found itself isolated and had no choice but to build up a socialist basic economy, industrialization under its own steam against a hostile capitalist world. The way in which it was done and the suppression of democracy and the crimes and so on and mass the murders of Stalin and so on were another matter. But to they are indeed another matter, because to say that these flowed automatically from the decision of the Soviet Union to industrialize is basically to say either that any country that finds itself in the position that the Soviet Union found itself in, namely on its own, and it had no alternative, as I say, all the appeal for international revolution by Lenin and Trotsky didn't succeed, either that it has not to industrialize and so on, in which case it doesn't go forward at all, or that it has to industrialize, but Stalinism and Stalinist crimes are inevitable. I don't believe that they were inevitable, and that is why I say that the question of Stalinist crimes was separate from the building of socialist industry in the Soviet Union. But in looking at the solution of the problem of the Soviet Union, which is deeply affected by the effects of that Stalinism. It's necessary to start from where we are, and that means to say with the recognition of the low level of socialist consciousness of the majority of the working class in the West, rather than with wishful thinking that we can expect some dramatic upturn leading to an international revolution in the period ahead. Chris offered on Friday evening 3 possible scenarios for Soviet development. 1, Gorbachev could be overthrown by the right. Not totally excluded, or under certain circumstances that I referred to, though it seems to me improbable precisely because Gorbachev and the radical perestroika forces together command the initiative and the old right-wing forces are discredited and can't get their act together. Second scenario appears, Gorbachev under pressure at home could become like Gomulka and the leader of the right wing. Even more improbable precisely because Gorbachev has staked everything on the carrying through of a radical reform precisely because he recognized exactly where the old right-wing bureaucratic policies left. Third possibility in Chris's scenario, explosion of erupting volcano, his words, before long, also his words. This is the perspective that he welcomes and wants to contribute to by calling for strikes. He criticises the radical perestroika forces for not doing so, and confrontation, smashing of the state, and you have also articles by people like Andy Zambroski talking about the breakup of the USSR and so on. If anything is likely to contribute to the first scenario, i.e. the right-wing forces getting rid of Gorbachev, it seems to me precisely that kind of perspective. The position in the Soviet Union, let's face it, economically and nationally, is extremely fragile. And indeed, there is a danger with that type of policy, not that obviously the SWP says it's going to have a great effect inside the Soviet Union, but there is a great danger in recommending that policy that you lead to in fact, to chaos. It seems to me that this is a completely irresponsible perspective, and that indeed the only serious perspective, with all the problems contained within it, is to support the development of the forces in the Communist Party around Gorbachev and Yeltsin. There's certainly a heterogeneous collection and so on, but the whole general course of perestroika, their success is not guaranteed. But the perspective of democratic reform in this way seems to me to offer, on balance, a much better chance of taking the Soviet Union forward to genuine democracy and genuine self-management socialism than the SWP's alternatives, which indeed are nowhere developed in a thought-out way and which rely on wishful thinking. What we need is not wishful thinking, but hard-headed and constructive Marxist thinking. Thank you.
Chris Harman will now reply for 20 minutes. Before he does so, can I remind people about the speaker's script, and again encourage people to indicate, in particular, if you want to come in and support Monty Johnson in the debate, and hand those into the stewards who are going around now. Okay, Chris.
See, Monty, it's true, he's been debating the clip for 25 years. I first heard him debate 25 years ago. But I don't want to repeat what he said then, any more than what I want to repeat. I want to repeat what he wrote at the time of Slansky Hall in 1953, or of Stalin's death in 1953. What I want to concentrate on is a series of positions he's developed as he recanted from his view that the sun shone in the Soviet Union and everything was wonderful. He developed a series of positions since about 1964, which argue on the one hand, and we fully agree with, against repression in Eastern Europe and China and so forth, for democratization of those countries, but at the same time combines that with the belief that basically the foundations of those countries are socialist foundations, that essentially the process by which the Soviet Union arrived at where it is today was in global terms correct, although terrible mistakes were made on the way. Let me repeat it today. He said the Soviet Union, he said, in 1928 had no choice but to industrialize. Actually, I'm sorry, Monty, We can read the debates today in books like Ryman's book, or E.H. Carr's book. There was a choice, there were arguments, there were three different positions. And actually, we know who took the position to industrialise. Joseph Stalin, as you yourself wrote, in 19, is where you put it, in 1966 in New Left Review, Stalin, in an extraordinarily difficult situation, said the development of Stalin, in an extraordinarily difficult situation, led the development of defence as the economic and cultural foundations of socialism. That was his great historic merit. Of course, you go on to criticise the particular means he uses, as if somehow you can separate the industrialisation from the collectivisation. As if somehow you can separate the industrialisation from child labour. As if somehow you can separate the industrialisation from the seizing of eastern Poland, from the seizing of the Baltic states, and so forth. However, you want to claim is this. And then, of course, you always went on to argue how wrong Trotsky was when he criticised socialism in one country, because you argued, and it seemed very clear, self-obvious in the mid-1960s to most people on the left. You said socialism is there, socialism is work. Trotsky was quite wrong to criticise the notion of socialism in one country. Today, we actually have to say, and the reality today we look at inside the Eastern Bloc is the reality of crisis. That reality of crisis brings out absolutely clearly the basic central faults in your analysis then. The notion that the economy was going from strength to strength, that socialism in one country had somehow worked. When today you can read the reports of Rishkov, of the Congress of Delegates of the Supreme Soviet, the country rolling moving towards problems, when you have people, when you have a series of Russian economists, one of whom is going to be Deputy Prime Minister, talking about the whole country being engulfed in crisis in 2 years or 3 years' time, when you talk about the need to trade with the West and so forth, you're actually saying that that basic picture, which you derive from the economic achievement of socialism, which always underlies your arguments, has begun to fall apart. Something else, however, also should begin to catch up. The idea, in the process, I remember the argument 25 years ago, it's worth repeating this in a minute. It used to be the case, argument after argument, no unemployment inside the USSR. Tell it to the Uzbekistan, tell it to the people in the Turkmen SSR, tell it to the people in the Karabakh, for whom the question of unemployment was a motivating force in their struggles. But the second thing, you see, and then when Monty says, that the counter idea of the idea of socialism being developed was somehow that capital accumulation is necessary for any society, and he comes to quote Marx. Let's have the quotation from Marx. Let's have the quotation from the Communist Manifesto. In bourgeois society, living labour is but a means to increase accumulated labour. In communist society, accumulated labour is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the labourer. There's a difference, absolute difference between chalk and cheese, between the notion, of course, under socialism, human beings determine that every year there's a certain amount of investment, and that's determined by the needs of the national population, and the forced industrialisation. We must catch up and overtake the Western states in 10 years. The message of Stalin, the continual message of Rishkov, the Region Conference. We have to go along with the petrochemical developments in the Tumen province of Western Siberia, because if we don't do so, we won't be able to compete with the West. We have to say, actually, the notion that the socialism in one country solved the economic problems, solved the basic situation of the country, overcame Trotsky was wrong in those arguments, and that somehow Stalin was right, that notion is been proved wrong in practice. When it's proved wrong in practice, that leads to something else. You see, Monty quotes me of saying in my book, there can't be reform in Eastern Europe. It's funny, I think you should read the whole book next time, Monty. Because as the book goes through, the experiences of reform in Eastern Europe. I don't say there was no reform in 1953 in East Germany. I said that the reform led, the beginning of reform, led to the German workers' uprising. The German workers' uprising was crushed, and that's the end of reform. I don't say there's no reform in Poland and Hungary in 56. Read the chapters on the reform, the intellectuals, the crooked circle, and so forth. Read the discussion of how the newspapers freed themselves from state censorship in Poland and Hungary in 1956. And then look how the bureaucracy reacted. Bureaucracy committed to capital accumulation, bureaucracy a class apart from the working class, faced with reform, faced with loose control situation, then reacted back. And then I argued, later on in the book, I argued the economic crisis can lead to splits in the bureaucracy. Splits in the bureaucracy lead to sections of the bureaucracy to talk about reform. actually, once they talk about reform, they unleash forces they can't control. Once they unleash forces they can't control, then the bureaucracy will try to hold back the reform. But then you actually look, and let's look at the concrete developments in the USSR in the recent period. See, let's look at the Congress of Delegates, the Congress of Deputies. And, you see, you don't have to go on what I say about it. You see, I think about 18 months ago, in Marx and Today, Monty interviewed a man called Yuri Afanasyev, who's a historian, one of the pioneering historians of the last couple of years, who began to tell the truth about the 1920s and 1930s. At that time, Afanasyev was a Gorbachev supporter. What did he actually say at the Congress of Deputies? I think it was the second or third day of the Congress of Deputies. He said, he described the election to the Supreme Soviet by the Congress of Deputies. He said, "We have formed a Stalin-Brezhnev type of Supreme Soviet. You, Mikhail Sergeyevich," meaning Gorbachev, "you, Mikhail Sergeyevich, you're either listening attentively to this majority or cleverly influencing it." That is it. Afanasyev was saying, "Gorbachev, you joined up with the conservative majority of the bureaucracy against the forces pushing for change." Let's take another instance of the Congress. When General Rodionov, the man who supervised the Tbilisi massacre, stood up and addressed the Congress. It's true that there were prisoners of the Congress at the Tbilisi massacre. But when Rodionov stood up to defend the massacre, he got overwhelming support from the majority of the delegates. The majority with whom, in the course of the Congress, Gorbachev showed he was aligned himself, albeit reluctantly, albeit with reservations. You go through the other decisions of the Congress. You see, Monty said they raised the slogan, "all-powerful Soviets." You should have added, they then postponed the elections to the local Soviets because they do not want the alternative lists to win in Moscow or Leningrad or Vilnius and so forth. They postponed them to give them time to try and control and organise and get on top. Hopefully they won't succeed. Hopefully things will upset them. But I kept saying the majority of the Congress, and this means Gorbachev went along and pushed his policy. It's no surprise, you see it. It's good to hear that Monty was in the Baltic States, but you hear what Brzezinski, who's head of the Lithuanian Communist Party, told the meeting of the Central Committee last week. The Lithuanian Central Committee, he said, "Unfortunately, the progressive resolutions adopted at the 19th Party Congress a year ago, 19th Party Conference a year ago, did not bring about much change. The CPSU Central Committee is not hurrying to fulfill the adopted resolutions." That is, he's talking about the door has been open to reform, having seen the forces emerging, then the majority of the bureaucracy, and increasingly the left in Russia, identified by Gorbachev as the majority of the bureaucracy, are slamming the door on reform. It's no wonder that Sakharov, who doesn't often temper his statements, perhaps doesn't give him enough consideration for what he says that Gorbachev, at the same time becoming more popular in the West, is becoming less popular inside the USSR itself. It's no wonder that one of these meetings, which Monty described in the Luzhniki Stadium, members of the Socialist Initiative Group from Moscow were cheered to the rafters. Actually, you can't be cheered to the rafters in a car park, but were cheered overwhelmingly when they stood up and said, "We do not trust you, Gorbachev, anymore. We no longer believe your promises." Because what you have is a process we've seen before. The drive to capital accumulation has come to an impasse in the USSR. It's reached a situation where they cannot proceed with the accumulation process without such massive attacks on working class living standards. They live in fear of an upsurge from below. It's not surprising that the first news source change in the USSR came under the Andropov regime shortly after the rise and fall of solidarity in Poland. They live in fear of eruptions from below. They do things that often been done before in history. Leaders emerge who try to carry through reform from above in order to stop the revolution from below. Just as Necker did in the 1780s in France, those of you who have been to Duncan's lectures. That's just as the military industrial committees did in Russia in the First World War, 1914, 1915, 1916, try and push for reform in order to stop revolution from below. You have the pressure for reform in order to stop upsurge from below. And the reform then lead to open up and lead precisely. I mean, Monty claims, I think there's been no changes. Anyone who's read my articles has gone at great length about what's been revealed, the excitement of reading the Russian press today, the transformations, the changes, the excitement of the situation. But you also have to look what the movements, the real movements taking place are. At the same time as all this excitement, you have a decided move to the right among sections of the bureaucracy trying to stop the changes taking place. And we've seen it before, let's say we've seen it before. We did see it, 1953 to 1956, the rise of Khrushchev in Russia. I wasn't around at the time, I was very, very young at the time, but if you read now the books of some of my guys at Deutsche, welcoming Khrushchev. Khrushchev is going to move inexorably from the socialist face of the economy to socialist democracy. The 20th Party Congress speech, which I want to refer to, February 1956, Khrushchev announced to Stalin. November 1956, 20,000 people in Hungary, 20,000 workers, paid the price in blood for the reality that Khrushchev come open the door to reform, slammed the door shut on reform. I do remember, Gomulka in Poland, in 1956-57. When I became politically active, it was the fashion on the left to adore Gomulka very much as people adore Gorbachev today. And I used to adore Gomulka. I used to believe there were three socialist countries in the world: Cuba, Poland, and Yugoslavia. The reality, if you read the history of Poland in the 1960s, 1968, the anti-Semitism pushed through, at least with Gomulka's connivance. The shootings down in 1970 of the workers, done by Gomulka or with Gomulka's connivance. The great reformer ends up covered in blood. We have the example of Deng Xiaoping in China. Just think, I don't know what Monty wrote on Deng 10 or 12 years ago, hopefully, for him, he didn't write anything. But you have the picture of the reformer, the great progressor, man 3 times Time Magazine's Man of the Year, the great reformer, and then you have the tanks driving over the people, the working students in their tents in Tiananmen Square, the random shooting, the great reformer has blood on his hands. And we have to say, this history makes us suspect that there's nothing about Gorbachev which means that he can avoid the same historic trends. Indeed, already. Let's have a look at the record of the most recent period. Have a look at the decree last autumn on unofficial demonstrations. Have a look at the decree carried through in April of this year upon 3 to 10 years imprisonment for insulting the Soviet state or any one of its representatives or any representative of any of the union bodies are recognised by the Soviet state as any local Communist Party chief. The decree upon agitation against the integrity of the Soviet state. You have in the Soviet constitution the right comes to self-determination, then you have the decree saying you can't argue in favour of self-determination, it's illegal. More to the point, have a look at the record of the events in Tbilisi. Have a look at the events in Tbilisi. What's actually happened? We don't know. Someone sent in the troops to shoot down 20, or possibly, not shoot down, sorry, but to batter to death 20 or 30 people who demonstrated on the streets, mainly women. Someone sent to sign the order. The argument came at the Congress, who signed the order? Did Gorbachev know? If Gorbachev knew, he didn't say. If he knew, he didn't denounce who'd done it. He didn't actually separate himself from it. There's blood on someone's hands on the Tbilisi event, and some of that blood seems to lie somewhere in the direction of Gorbachev. Now, we have to then say, why does Gorbachov behave in this way? Being here, I wish... Here, that's a great book you learn from the writing of Trotsky. It's got to right. Where, if you read the Revolutionary Trade, Trotsky describes, he says the party is the party of the bureaucracy, cut off physically, a party of the managers, a party of the apparatchiks, a party of the police chiefs, a party of the generals, a party of the bulk of whose members, certainly bulk of the members in leading positions, have living standards incomparably higher than the mass of workers. It's a party which cannot be reformed. Trotsky argues it very, very clearly. Can't be reformed because there's no case in history of a ruling class, or Trotsky used the word class, a ruling class, a ruling group like this, reforming itself out of existence, doing away with its own privileges. We have a deeper understanding of it, because these privileges don't arise from nowhere. They arise from precisely from the role it played in the accumulation process in the USSR, the way in which it leads the accumulation it carried through the exploitation of Russia's workers in order to maintain accumulation in competition with states outside the USSR. In that situation, the idea that the party is going to transform itself and change itself, the idea that the state can just be wished away, that the general Rodionos, the people who did the shooting in Tbilisi, are just going to walk away. The idea that intrinsically, automatically, what's not a very democratic Congress of Deputies this time will become more democratic in 4 years' time or 5 years' time. That doesn't actually fit with reality at all. The reality is this. You're talking about a country which you have this ruling elite, this ruling class, we call it a ruling class, moving into deeper and deeper economic crisis. As it moves into deeper and deeper economic crisis, all sorts of tensions rise in one part of the country or another. Monty laughed at my talk about spontaneous revolt. I don't know how you describe what took place in Armenia, or what took place in Georgia, or what took place in Moldavia, or what took place not nearly in such a positive sense. What has been taking place in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and the Turkmen SSR. You're talking about a spontaneous upheaval, spontaneous upsurges from below. Faced with that, you have to say, how is the bureaucracy going to react? Is it just going to sit back and say, it's all tough, it's all nasty, and so on and so forth? Or is it increasingly going to take conservative positions to try to hold on to society as it knows it? Won't it behave like every ruling class has behaved in history, which identifies its own rule with the future of civilization, identifies its own privileges with the benefits for the whole of mankind, and therefore will crush mercilessly the developments which take place? If in the process it crushes elements of reform and democracy so that it itself tries to develop in order to deal with the economic crisis, then it will crush them. Face that situation, what do we say to people in Russia? Do we say, just put your faith in Gorbachev, put a bit of pressure on him, don't worry that he signed these decrees, don't worry that he won't sack the people responsible for the Tbilisi massacre, don't worry that he has no solution to the problems facing you? Or do we say, actually, the only way to preserve the small areas of glasnost which have been developed at the moment is independent initiative from below? Independent initiative means crucially three things. I mean, firstly, supporting every struggle against central bureaucracy. You have to be clear which side you're on in Tbilisi. It's no good saying we don't want the bloodshed. Are you for the people who are on the streets, or are you for the people shooting them down? Secondly, you have to, and you can't equivocate on the question. And that means you have to be absolute for the right of self-determination of each and every one of the nationalities inside the USSR, whether they have recognised socialist republics or like the Armenians and the Karabakh, they don't have recognition by the state. Secondly, you have to say in this situation, we are for the development of the working class independent force. When you read about the privileges of bureaucracy, when you read about lousy conditions that the workers live, if you want workers to support democratisation, you want to support the freedom of the press, the most elementary thing you have to demand the right of workers to form their own trade unions. And don't talk about reforming the 140 million strong official unions. We only have one case in the eastern states of genuine trade unions emerging. Solidarność in Poland, it didn't take place to reform existing unions. And the third thing you have to say, if you want these first two things, you have to say you need political initiative, independent of the existing party. The existing party, let's be clear, is a party of the bureaucracy, it's not a party of the workers. There's no way the workers can take over that party. When you look at the social composition of it, when you look who the secretary, who the chief secretary, who run the central committee, even who run the factory branches, there's no way the process is going to take